Oh, hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Piercing Wizard podcast. For those of you watching the video version, hello. For those of you listening to the audio version, hello. This episode is going to be focusing on needles. I just recently published a video on my Patreon page, patreon.com/RyanPBA, talking all about needles and kind of the history of what a body piercing specific needle is and how we got to it. And I don't really think that you can do that conversation justice without bringing up Jim Ward, founder of the Gauntlet. So I put this class together, recorded it, put it on Patreon, but then it really got me thinking, like, I have some unanswered questions. I really want to talk to Jim Ward. And fortunately, Jim Ward it was kind enough to come on the show this week. So I've got a video / audio podcast for you, available on all podcast platforms. But if you're listening to the audio version, you can go to my precisionbodyarts.com YouTube page. You can see the video version there. I'll also put it on patreon.com/RyanPBA for anyone who's interested. But I recorded that conversation with Jim Ward, and I'll be sharing it for you within just a few minutes. And something that I brought up in the class was that as body piercers, we're all kind of part of the same family tree. And if you follow the branches, you go down the trunk, when you get to the roots of body piercing, it was really medical needles. Medical needles are what started us on the path to having a purpose-specific body piercing needle. So talking about needles that had a plastic hub to connect it to a syringe, maybe a plastic sleeve, a cannula to attach it to IV tubing. You have one branch of that family tree who looked at the needle with the hub, with the cannula, and thought like, okay, this is what we have available to us. What can we do with this needle to create a body piercing and install jewelry? But then the other side of that coin, the other branch of that family tree was Jim Ward, who was starting out with a medical needle with a plastic hub on it, and then thinking, well, if we just clipped off this hub, we'd be able to do our jewelry transfers a lot more easily. So it's a really fascinating conversation, and it's important history, because just like 30 or 40 years ago, they weren't really thinking about what we have access to today, what we think of today as a body piercing needle. And I would imagine that the same thing, another 30 or 40 years from now, when we're talking about body piercing in 2050, I doubt that they'll be using the exact same needles. I'm sure some will, but I'm sure others will evolve beyond what we're using today. I think you can kind of start to see the origins of that potential future evolution today with the body piercers who are modifying their needles, who are doing needle crushing, different needle bends, and experimenting with different kinds of needle coatings, all this different stuff. Connector pins and transfer assists and all that stuff. We're going to have a lot of needle innovations over the next few years. But I wanted to bring it back a little bit, and I wanted to talk about some of the needle innovations that led us to what we have today as body piercers. So there's no better person to talk to in regards to that topic than Jim Ward, founder of the Gauntlet. So we'll be talking with Jim in just a few minutes. For you, if you're interested in learning a little bit more about needles, if you're interested in seeing that video, it's available now on demand on the $15 a month tier at patreon.com/RyanPBA. I have quite a few other videos on there. The gloves class, if any of you have seen the gloves class, attended the recording session of the gloves class, you'll know that I was doing a lot of like hands-on, no pun intended, demonstration of how you put on gloves and talking about the different kinds of gloves, materials of gloves, things like that. The needles class, it's more slideshow driven, and it's really to get you thinking about what body piercing needles are today. You have lots of piercers operating in the United Kingdom, in Europe, other parts of the world who are using cannulas. They kind of branched off, like the piercers kind of doing the style that US piercers are doing, using what we might refer to now as a blade needle or a tri-bevel body piercing needle. A lot of those piercers were directly influenced by the work of Gauntlet and the work of Jim Ward. The piercers operating in the UK and in Europe, during the conversation with Jim, we'll kind of talk about maybe some of the piercers that might have influenced them. And it's a really fun conversation. But if you'd like to see my needles presentation, go to patreon.com/RyanPBA. There are parts of that where I mentioned the concept of bevel theory. That's not something that I can get really in depth on in another presentation. You can't really tack bevel theory onto another subject and really do it justice. So for some of the people that have been asking, I do plan on offering my full bevel theory class again sometime in the early summer. I'm aiming for maybe a date around July, but since that's kind of close to my birthday and some other holidays, and because COVID has gotten things so screwy for the potential of being able to leave my house and be a human, I haven't really been able to set a date yet. But if you want to kind of put it on your radar early, I do plan on offering my full bevel theory day probably sometime around July. But as I get closer to locking down a date, I'll be sure to share that with you. And if you're not already following it, go ahead and give Body Art Education by Ryan Ouellette a follow on Facebook. You can also follow Ryan PBA on social media, and you know I'm just going to bombard people with any sort of class announcements there anyway. So for now, let's go ahead and get into this conversation with Gauntlet founder, with APP founder, Jim Ward. And I'll be back a bit more at the end. For those who might not recognize your face or your voice, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
I'm Jim Ward. Some people call me the grandfather of the modern body piercing movement. I started a business called Gauntlet back in 1975 with the inspiration of my friend and mentor, Doug Malloy, who was a West Hollywood, or actually a Hollywood millionaire with a passion for piercing. That was his kink. And that's where actually all of this grew out of, was the kink community, the fetish community. And so to answer your question, I pierced my own nipples when I lived in New York in the late 60s. I had met a couple of guys who were part of the gay SM leather scene in New York, and they introduced me to it. It just was something that naturally had been lurking in my subconscious for a long, long time, actually since the onset of puberty. Mm-hmm. But somewhere along the line, after I had gotten into this community, I read a magazine article about a man who had sailed around the world in his sailboat, and when he finished his circumnavigation of the globe, he decided he wanted an ear pierce to commemorate that event, which turns out actually to be a historic way of marking the various sea voyages. There's documentation that sailors would pierce various parts of their bodies to commemorate these events. There was a difference in whether it was crossing the equator or going around the Horn or around the world or whatever, but there were these traditions. And there was something in that article that kind of, I don't know, it set off a little something in my psyche. And I decided I wanted to get an ear pierced. And this was in 1968. It was one of those fantasies that just wouldn't go away. So I had a friend I'd met, developed a friendship with. I joined the New York Motorbike Club, which was a gay leather club there in New York. And I met this guy who had been a merchant marine, and he had piercings in his ears and little stars tattooed on the lobes. So I got him to come over and pierce one of my ears. Did the left ear, because those were the days, when the right ear meant that you were gay. Oh, God forbid. And so he came over and pierced my left ear one day. And I was working a straight kind of job. So I thought, well, we'll put in a little stud earring from the department store, and I'd put a little Band-Aid over it every day, and I'd go into work. And I figured if somebody asked, I'd just say, well, I cut myself shaving.
I shave my ears every day.
This went on for like 6 weeks while it healed. but nobody ever noticed or ever asked. So at the end of the 6 weeks, I was able to take the stud out during the day and put it back in at night. But subsequently, after that, I've always enjoyed, since the onset of puberty or soon after, this realization that nipple play was actually very sexy. That was very stimulating. And somewhere along the line, this fantasy began to evolve of, wow, wouldn't it be sexy to have pierced nipples? And at that point in my life, I'd never met anyone or known anyone who had pierced nipples. And so finally, one day I got up the nerve. I had an ex-boyfriend who was a watchmaker who had some gold wire in his little kit of watchmaking tools. And I got out this wire and cut off some little lengths of it. It's very thin. It was probably 22 gauge or something, but I made these little circles out of the wire. I got a push pin and the cork from a wine bottle, and I put one on one side and one on the other. Yeah,
Yeah.
Well, that part went fine, but then it's, how do you get that little piece of wire through the hole?
Yeah.
That was the challenge. And I mean, with determination, it's possible, and I managed. But, I didn't know any better. So years passed. My nipples finally healed up, and I had jewelry in them. Went to the department store and bought some little gold earring things that I wore for a long time. And I eventually met somebody that I was romantically involved with, and moved to Denver, Colorado, where I joined the local leather club there, the Rocky Mountaineers. And we had a run one weekend where some guys were coming in from out of town. So this guy came in from Omaha, Nebraska, and he saw my piercings and decided he wanted me to pierce his nipples. So I got out the push pin, or a push pin, and another cork from the wine bottle and pierced his nipples, which he was my first client, and I don't even remember his name. But at any rate, time passes, and I end up in LA and meet my friend and mentor, Doug Malloy. About that time, I was dating a guy whose name was Eric, and he also wanted his nipples pierced. And I decided, well, there has to be a better way to do this. So I called up Doug and I said, my buddy Eric wants his nipples pierced, and I know there's got to be a better way. Can you, A, share with me how you do this, and B, what do we do about jewelry? So he said, sure, I'll help you out. And I've got this little kit of equipment and tools that I use, and I'm willing to share it with you. So great. So we put our heads together. Long story short, I won't go into the first jewelry making experience and how that all came into being, but I made some jewelry for the piercings, and Doug came over and we pierced Eric's nipples. And in Doug's little kit were a whole half a dozen, I don't know how many, of those thick hypodermic needles that vets use on horses, I guess. They were probably equivalent to 14 gauge, 16 gauge. There was a variety of them, but they were kind of in that rough range. He also had an ear piercing gun that was one of the old fashioned ones. It wasn't spring loaded. You had to push it through and then pull out and leave a little cannula in the piercing. I think that's actually what we used for the first piercing, but Doug had kind of made acquaintances with all these people around the world who were interested in body piercing. It was very much a fetish thing at the time. But he had also placed ads in the local gay press, and met people. And he called me up one day and he said, you know, there's this guy in Hollywood who wants a Prince Albert piercing. And I think you should go over and do it. So actually, no, that's a different story. We'll get to that next time. Actually, there was a fellow who had come into town from New York named Jim, and he actually had his nipples pierced. I don't remember who did it, somebody back in New York, but Jim had contacted Doug and wanted a Prince Albert, and he was staying in a hotel in Hollywood. So Doug and I went to his hotel room, and fortunately, my mother had been an assistant to an ophthalmologist for 20 some years. So I'd learned something about sterilization and the importance of autoclaving and this sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I didn't have an autoclave, but I had a pressure cooker.
Mm-hmm.
And so in those early days, that's what I did with everything. I stuck it in the pressure cooker, and at least theoretically, it was acceptable as a form of sterilization. It was better than just soaking things in alcohol,
Right.
which was what most people would do.
Yeah.
But we went to Jim's hotel room and got up all the stuff. I got the needle through. In those days, guys and gals, believe me, doing a Prince Albert into the head of a Q-tip is no easy feat.
I'd imagine not.
But somehow I rather blundered my way through and managed it. But then came the challenge of getting the piece of jewelry to follow that beveled point on the hypodermic needle.
Mm-hmm.
And we ended up with a rather bloody mess, and probably more by force than by luck. We got the jewelry in,
Mm-hmm.
but this little light bulb went on in my head, like, you know, if I chopped off that hub, that syringe hub, I could follow that needle through with the jewelry and no problem.
Yeah.
And so that's what I did. I went back, chopped the end off, and voila, the first piercing needle was born. That was a long way of telling you the story.
Well, no, that's great. I mean, the more detail, the better, because I just want people to understand like the origins of this. What would you have a rough guess on what year that might have been?
That would have been in the mid 70s, you know, like 70 somewhere. Gauntlet, I started Gauntlet in November of 75. So this would probably been somewhere early in 1975. It was actually Doug took me to lunch one day after I'd done Eric's nipples. He said, you know, this is a business opportunity, and I think you should start this business. And with a little bit of money from him and some inspiration, that's how it all got started.
It's great to hear these stories. How long would you estimate that you were operating with like a modified medical needle? And do you remember like kind of the origins of like a piercing specific needle? Was that something that you were having made, or is that something that another vendor came out with?
Actually, we were struggling through with those god-awful veterinary needles, reusing them up until the AIDS epidemic started. Mm-hmm. I was buying needles from this medical supply place in New York City, and the quality was not always consistent, and some of them were really, really dull. Mm-hmm. They had actually a rounded point that in theory was supposed to cut through, but didn't do a very good job.
Yeah.
And we were reusing needles. I would put them through the autoclave. By that time, I had an autoclave. I'd put them through the autoclave, and then I'd run a wire through them to get all the crap out,
Mhm.
and then package them and autoclave them a second time.
Yeah.
And they just kept getting duller, duller,
Sure.
duller. And then when the AIDS epidemic hit, I realized that we had to do disposables. We
Mhm.
just could not go on doing, even though in theory the autoclaving would, especially with HIV, would be sufficient.
Yeah.
It was not, there was no guarantee, at least as far as HEP was concerned,
Mhm.
but it was a good, it was a reliable, it was reliable that it would kill HIV.
Sure. Well, for perspective too, this is also an era when doctors and other medical professionals, they weren't even wearing exam gloves for even sometimes
Yeah.
like simple surgeries, so I think some younger people are going to be shocked when they hear the concept of reusing a needle, but again, at the time there was no such thing as a piercing needle, and I think a lot of sterilization for medical, surgical and dental was nowhere near where it is today, and it would be the same thing with most other industries.
Right. And tattooists were also in the same boat. They
Right.
were,
They had the bucket with the sponge, and they were just wiping down tattoos with the same bucket and sponge all day.
ugh, I'm glad that Cliff Raven was at least a step above that.
Yeah.
um, at any rate, when the AIDS epidemic hit, I contacted, I forget which one of the major medical suppliers it was. It was one of the major ones, that made manufactured hypodermic needles.
Yeah.
And there was a bit of a challenge getting them to understand what it was that I wanted.
Mhm.
And they actually used the terminology, oh, what you want is a cannula.
Hmm.
Now, that's not to be confused with cannula as you define cannula, with a sleeve over the needle.
Yep.
This was basically nothing more than a hypodermic needle with missing the syringe.
Right.
And we were able to get them from this company, manufactured to our specifications. Unfortunately, they were still pretty meh.
Yeah.
They were not very sharp.
Hmm.
And it wasn't until well into the 90s, when I don't remember who the first person was. It was Derek Dakota who started
I wouldn't be shocked if it was.
was somebody started making needles specifically for piercing.
Hmm.
And it has changed changed our world, as it were.
Yeah.
I am always just, it's so refreshing to do a piercing with a needle that just goes,
Yeah.
without, believe me, I used thimbles. We manufactured those old needle pushers.
I think some studios still have those today, and again, for people to realize, like, imagine if you were piercing with something where the entire force of your arm and your fingers, you can't get that through. I remember some of the needles that I started with in the 90s where you just really had to fight to get it through something tough like a nipple. And needle pushers, again, some younger piercers today might be like, a what? A needle what? But yeah, you had to have basically like something to put on the back end of it and help you shove it through, because like you really had to put some
Oh,
muscle
yeah.
into it.
And people don't realize how tough some tissue can be,
Yeah.
especially with those individuals who enjoy like nipple play,
Hmm.
and they've got some tough tissue in there.
Right.
Oh yeah, that's a challenge.
So let me see what other questions I might have based on that. Um, when it came to when it came to Gauntlet as like the company, the entity where you started to have multiple piercers coming in, multiple locations, things like that, was it kind of like a standard needle that was being distributed between all the different studios, all the different piercers, or was it like everybody's kind of free to find their own implement?
No, we had it was the same needle, went to all locations, all piercers used them, and they were disposed of after use. They weren't exactly single use. They were used on one person
Right.
and then discarded.
Mhm.
Now, of course, in most cases that I'm aware of, if you do two nipples, you get two needles. But
I think part of that is as needle design geometry has advanced. Now that the blades are so much longer, the geometry has made them a bit thinner. I think that they're a bit more prone to, like, warping and degradation after one use. Yeah, they start to maybe not like dramatically kink, but I do recall a needle. I pierced the nipple. I don't know, at some point in the early 2000s, and I remember pushing and really having to muscle it through. And when it came out the other end, even just that one piercing, the needle tip had gotten folded over.
oh yeah.
Yeah, pretty rough. So, what, I don't know if you have any like stories that maybe stick out in your mind of like, not horror stories, because I wouldn't imagine that's what it is, but certain piercings where you really just kind of had to fight to get the piercing completed. I would imagine certain kinds of genital piercings, nipple piercings, it was a bit of a challenge to start to develop the skills of like jewelry transfers and how you were like physically moving the needle through the body and all that stuff. So any memories that stick out during those like early experimentation days of hubless needles or piercing specific needles?
Um, what was this? The other thing, the other event that happened early on was, as I said, Doug was using this ear piercing gun
Mm,
to do nipple piercings. And that's I'd started out kind of initially using that gun for doing nipples
mhm.
until we went to this guy's apartment to pierce his nipples. And that that needle just went
Yeah.
because the tissue was so tough,
Mhm.
and I had to get out, one of the hypodermic needles to actually do the piercing. Um, we were still using Pennington forceps in that time,
Mhm.
which people still do. Um, and so I managed to get everything. The clamp was still in place, so I was easy enough to go through with the hypodermic. We're in the same location that the ear piercing gun had failed, but it took a lot of muscle even then
Yeah.
just to get that through. And then, of course, things like ampulangs, where you've got a lot of tissue
Yeah.
to get through. Um, and I remember later also, one of the few times I had a needle stick was doing dido piercings.
Mm.
And that tissue is kind of, I want to say stringy, but it's not exactly so much tough as it is kind of stretchy.
Yeah.
And the needle came out wrong and I poked myself.
Mm.
Um, that was the major downside of those dull needles, was the risk of needle sticks. It's like the same principle with a sharp knife and a dull knife.
Right.
You have a much higher risk of cutting yourself with a dull one than a sharp one.
Yeah, because you have to apply more force and then it's less control.
Right.
Yeah. Hmm. Um, so as far as like needle size, do you have like a concept of what like the largest like adapted medical needles you were using? Like if you're talking about something like an amp, was that like a thicker size, like a 12 or a 10, or were you kind of sticking around that like 14 gauge kind of territory?
And those, even up until Gauntlet's demise, which was in '98, we were still probably on the conservative side. We It depended, of course, on the piercing, but the most common sizes were like 14 and 12. Um, occasionally, depending on the piercing, 16. We never, that I recall, unless like it was an ear, maybe we'd go down to 18, but usually it was 16 was probably the minimum. And only for cosmetic, I'll call them cosmetic piercings.
Sure.
Any place where you're going to get action, you want something that's more substantial.
Yeah. Yeah. What about needle lubrication? Because I would imagine if the needles weren't all that sharp, you still had a lot of friction. So were you using any kind of like a lubricant on the needle at the time?
Very early on, we were using like Neosporin, which of course was not great, or triple antibiotic ointment in those early days. And then eventually we went to, we get those little packets of sterile lube and use that. And then came the glorious day when you didn't need it.
Yeah, I love coated needles. I used lubricant for a while. I'll still use lubricant every now and then for like a genital piercing or something where I want to try to make it a little bit easier on a client if I can. But now I'm such a baby when it comes to like, I want everything perfect. I'm such a micromanager with my piercing that if my fingertips are a little bit slippery from lubrication, it's just like, oh, it's impossible. How am I supposed to work under these conditions?
Oh, you poor child.
I know. How spoiled do you think the modern body piercer is compared to what you went through in the
in those good old days.
Yeah, the good old days. Well, is there anything else that that jumps out on your mind about kind of the evolution of needles that you wanted to share?
Not really. I mean, I am just delighted to see the advances that have been made. And now, of course, with the whole shaping the needle, crunching the needle, bending the needle, doing all these tricks, I'm just delighted to see how much is being done to make the whole experience easier for everyone.
Yeah. Well, you know, a lot of the innovations that are being made today might not have happened in the same way because it's kind of a direct evolution that you were really important in creating. I think that if you look at the worldwide piercing community, going back to my whole like analogy about a family tree, is like if most piercers started with like, okay, we have a pin or something like that, but then what's the evolution after that? Medical needles, that's where it really turned into that big branch of like, you had the innovators like yourself that were looking at it and being like, well, what can we do to modify this to make it work for our purposes? Then you had this other branch that was like, okay, you know, we have this with all these features. How can we apply it? So seeing those thought processes and work is fascinating to me. And you can really kind of see the whole branch of the family tree that you were the catalyst for, and, you know, through the Gauntlet days into APP days into what we have today. It's got a direct lineage back to you. And I just, I'm really fascinated by it all.
Well, a part of it too, I think, was those initial chopped off hypodermic needles were so ideal. I mean, if they had not worked so well, you know, the ability to put that jewelry up against the end of that tube and follow it through, if that had not been, that was really probably the deciding factor of why that stuck. If there was something else you could follow through that easily, then maybe we would have gone somewhere else.
Yeah.
But that was, I think that's really where one of the main deciding factors.
Yeah.
I don't know if anyone has tried something different.
I've heard people talk about different experimentation, but I don't think anything is quite so functional as that whole like hollow tri-bevel needle. Now I think you have all these people doing the modifications like crushing and flattening and all that because they're trying to figure out what the eventual next step will be. And I would imagine 10 or 20 years from now, we'll be having a conversation about some other design or innovation that came along. But I think if you hadn't gotten the industry kind of started there, I think somebody would have gotten to that eventually, but they might not have had the same kind of adaptations. More of us in the US might be using, the cannulas with the sleeves over it potentially. You never know. And I think
It's true.
really just your innovations and ideas that led us to what we have today.
It was my pleasure. I had so much fun.
Did you ever have any conversations with Doug about maybe needles that he had used before he found medical needles, or was it just kind of like, starting with that toolkit that he had and medical needles were there?
It never occurred to me that there
Yeah,
might have been
I would imagine it would be a lot tougher to perform a multitude of piercings with something that was, blunt, like a solid needle, a sewing needle, or a push pin or something like that. I would imagine that would be a lot more difficult to experiment with than those medical needles might have been.
Well, I also don't know that he ever did that many piercings.
Right.
Yeah.
He was more of a facilitator.
Yeah. And it was a fetish for him. But even so,
Yeah.
And he knew people. I mean, he knew like Tattoo Sammy in Frankfurt.
Yeah.
We met early on, after about the same time I met Doug. He introduced me to Alan Oversby, who is better known as Mr. Sebastian, the English version of me.
Yeah.
But I don't know actually what any of those, that's a good question. What was Mr. Sebastian using? What was Tattoo Sammy using? And if I ever knew, I've forgotten, which I apologize for.
Well, it's important that everybody has their own history, and those branches off the family tree. You can definitely go to something like the BMX Net conference in Germany, and you can kind of see the lineage of like Tattoo Sammy's influence, or you can go to UK APP and you can see the lineage of Mr. Sebastian's influence pretty clearly. And I'm fascinated by all of it.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the merchandise stuff that you've been doing for Gauntlet? Do you want to talk about that a bit?
Well, I hope you'll share my the URL for my website.
Certainly.
And tell people about, assuming they don't already know.
Well, I'm sure even if some people know a little bit, knowing a bit more is no bad thing.
If you want to know more about your history, check out my book.
Absolutely. I mention that on the show pretty frequently because I've learned a lot, and it really, you get all these great stories, and sometimes you can really just connect it to what's going on in your present day piercing practice. Your overall piercing community is looking back and being like, this is where that came from, and this is what influenced that. So if there are any piercers or piercing enthusiasts, or somebody working in a studio, or maybe you have goals to work in a studio one day, that book is really what I would say you should start with. And whenever I train new people, whenever I train apprentices, that's required reading so that they understand the origins of the industry.
I appreciate that. I also republished the manual that we used when we had piercer training seminars back in the late 90s.
Yeah.
That's available also through the website. And honestly, the information, some of it's dated. But I was delighted this last week. There's a piercer who is training another piercer using the board with the leather on it, learning how to get a feel for the needle. And I was tickled to see that. I thought that had fallen by the wayside.
Well, not everybody has to reinvent the wheel. A lot of this stuff works, and it's not that it worked for one person. It's that it worked for multiple piercers, multiple generations. So I would really, again, encourage anybody, don't ever think of information as completely outdated. Sometimes, yes, there can be historical information where we've evolved, after that, but knowing how this thought process started, and it helps you understand how we got to where we are, instead of just looking at the last step, being able to think through the thought process of yourself and multiple people, of taking that information and making small changes, small changes, small changes, until we are where we are today.
And good for you all.
So what is the website for people to know, so that they have the URL straight from you?
It's www.runningthegauntlet, spelled like that,
Mm-hmm.
with a hyphen, book.com.
Runningthegauntlet-book.com. Perfect.
And we have some other odds and ends, including shirts.
That's great. I've got quite a bit of it also. I don't know if I can turn this around so you can see it, but in my home office, I have the
Oh, cool.
the signed poster of you with your harp, and I've got one of your Gauntlet bandanas.
Oh, bravo. Thank you.
So these designs that you've been putting out for the shirts and the hankies and everything, were those historical designs that you had used in the past, or was that something new that you had put together for current day merch?
Yes and yes. The last iteration of the shirts was a design that Gauntlet had printed and sold back in the 1990s. This one that we just came out with the last couple of months, I mean, it's an old design, but we've kind of revamped it. It's got a kind of a shiny metallic silver ink. The old ones were printed in gray. But yeah, I play with the designs, use the old ones. This is still the old original logo from the very beginning. I designed this back when I started Gauntlet in 1975.
Can I ask, and if I had already learned and have forgotten, was there an origin story to why you chose Gauntlet as the name?
Well, actually, and yes, this is in the book. After Doug talked me into doing this thing, it was like, let's figure out a name for this business. And he had all sorts of fluffy names. He thought maybe some classical Greek name, like the Saint Sebastian, whatever, or, And one night I was just sitting on the couch watching TV. And at the time I had this wide leather watch band. It was like with metal studs on it. It was, and I took it off and I laid it on the end table and I looked over at it and it was like Gauntlet. In the English language, we have two expressions: running the gauntlet and throwing down the gauntlet. The one represents the challenge, the other represents the ordeal. And as far as I was concerned, there was no other perfect symbol for a business. It's a challenge and it can be an ordeal. So that's just how it happened.
And it's iconic. Like that logo, I think, is one of the more powerful logos that I've seen in the industry. I think anybody across the generations of body piercing can look at that logo and feel some sort of like connection to it. It's a very iconic logo, and I really appreciate the work and seeing it, and I really appreciate that it's still at the forefront when people talk about body piercing. I think everybody knows Gauntlet and knows what it created.
I'm glad. I'm glad to have been part of it.
I think you were more than part of it, but yeah, I certainly appreciate everything that you've done for the industry.
Well, thank you, Ryan. It's been a pleasure.
So runningthegauntlet-book.com. Is there any sort of other social media or contact info you'd want people to have?
There is a Running the Gauntlet a Facebook page. There's also one on Instagram, and I confess, that I have been bad about keeping those pages up.
Oh, that's okay.
Uh,
I think especially in the last year or so, like just relax and work on anything that makes you feel happy. Don't bother putting your energy into social media right now.
well, I appreciate that. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, thank you for talking to me again, Jim. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Oh, it's likewise. You take care.
You too. It's good talking to you.
Bye now.
Bye. I love talking with Jim Ward. Um, like I especially like the low key things when Jim is like, oh yeah, I just kind of came across this innovation and then changed the face of body piercing forever. It's really fascinating to talk to people like Jim Ward because he has such a wealth of information over decades. And we're fortunate enough that Jim is willing to share that information. Not all piercers are. Some piercers, they kind of close that chapter on their lives of my self-identity is a body piercer. Now I'm going to move on to other things, other careers or family life or whatever in life in general. And Jim Ward has certainly done all those things, but he has never forgotten or really moved on from his roots as being a body piercer, a body piercing innovator at his core. And I'm very appreciative of him sharing information. Again, if you've never read Running the Gauntlet, I would say that the first thing to do after listening to this podcast is, well, number one, sign up at patreon.com/RyanPBA. But second is go to the Running the Gauntlet website and buy a copy of that book from Jim Ward, runningthegauntlet-book.com. And for the video podcast, I'll put that at the bottom of the screen too. Go ahead and check it out. It's a really important document, and it'll really help you understand the industry that we have today, where it came from. The origins of a lot of body jewelry that we use today, the origin of needles, as we've said, but a lot of other things. The organization of our industry, the Association of Professional Piercers, that kind of grew out of Gauntlet. So it's a really great resource to learn a lot more about our industry and who we are as body piercers. So thank you for listening to the show. I would like you to go to patreon.com/RyanPBA, check out that needles class and any other sort of content. Keep your ears open for the date on my new bevel theory seminar coming up this summer. And if you have any questions, reach out to me. You can give me an email at ryanpba@gmail.com, or you can follow me on social media, RyanPBA. You can follow the show, piercingwizardpodcast.com, on social media, and it's available on all podcast platforms for free. So thank you for listening, and stay sharp.